This is slide 10 in our 50s unit, and we turn our attention to the beginnings of the Civil Rights Movement. This will go on through the 60s into the very early part of the 70s, but it does begin here in the 50s. So we're going to start here with voter registration. Right? Only about 20% of eligible Southern blacks were registered to vote. They had the right to vote, but the problem was getting registered to vote. And fewer than 5% were registered in the deep South states, like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, places like that, where law could not enforce segregation. Violence did. We've talked about the influence of the KKK and all of that. A very visible symbol of the segregation and the violence in the South takes place in 1955, where a 14-year-old young black boy named Emmett Till was murdered in Mississippi for allegedly leering at a white woman. The woman has since, many years later, changed her story that this never happened, but she claimed he did at the time. And he, Emmett Till, the young boy, was beaten to death by the woman's husband and some friends of his. This is what Emmett Till looked like as a 14-year-old boy. This is what he looked like in his casket. His mother insisted on an open casket funeral so the world could see what was done to her son. So Emmett Till becomes a very visible symbol of the segregation and the violence in the South directed at blacks. Okay. Eisenhower showed no real interest in following up the work of Harry Truman in terms of civil rights. Eisenhower was a very popular president. He could have done a lot for civil rights, but he didn't really want to rock the boat, so he doesn't focus on that. Instead, the Supreme Court kind of takes up the cause. In Brown versus the Board of Education. Right? This is the Topeka, Kansas Board of Education. Chief Justice Earl Warren shocked the traditionalists with his active judicial intervention. He used the courts to form law. Okay? In May 1954, the court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that segregation in public schools was illegal. Right? It was inherently unequal and therefore it was unconstitutional. Thurgood Marshall would be the attorney, the lawyer for Oliver Brown, whose young daughter was denied entrance to his school, an all-white school, just several blocks from her house. Instead, she had to walk several miles to get to the nearest bus stop, and then ride the bus miles more to get to the nearest black school. Right? And Brown sues that this is illegal because Plessy versus Ferguson, if you'll think way back to our first unit of the year, in terms of Reconstruction, a Supreme Court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that separate but equal was legal. That if you had you could have separate facilities for blacks and whites as long as they were equal. Well, Thurgood Marshall, Brown's attorney, argues that they are not equal simply by the fact that you have separated. If you've separated blacks and whites, you are saying that one is better than another, and therefore they're not equal. Because if they were equal, there would be no reason to separate them. So by the very act of separating races, you are declaring one is superior to another. It's a simple argument, but the Supreme Court was ready to make some changes. If Eisenhower wasn't going to, the Supreme Court was. Now, there is a problem, okay? As the Supreme Court writes the decision, they use some very specific language. Here you see it, with all deliberate speed. Okay? The Supreme Court ruling says that schools must be integrated with all deliberate speed. And the problem is nobody knows exactly what that means. What's fast for one part of the country is slow for another part. And by not putting a deadline on this, the southern states are in no hurry to integrate. So even though the Supreme Court says they have to integrate, nobody knows when that's actually going to happen.